Right, Ben, and you've rightly pointed out this is in fact an asymmetrical war, and we have this strategy of shock and awe on one side and this war of attrition on the other. But if we could just zoom in of what we are seeing from the Iranian side, where now officials are trying to decipher President Pezeshkian's apology and also the authority behind it. They have largely urged caution in reading it as a sign of Tehran seeking an off-ramp or surrender. Also, as Trump would like to categorize it, because neither side seems willing to step back at this point. Now, does that also heighten the risk of the conflict becoming more protracted than the U.S. would have liked?
I think there's a very high risk of it becoming more protracted. Like I said, if the IRGC successfully sort of weathers the initial blitz, which seems to have happened, then the IRGC, I mean, it's triggered its so-called decentralized mosaic defensive strategy. And what that means is that they've broken the forces into cells. They've been issued standing orders before this conflict started in preparation where they can act autonomously and pick targets on their own. And that means you've got a hydra, you've decapitated the central command, but the military machine still works. And now you've got to stamp out, multiple small bushfires across Iran amongst the coalition forces. And that's going to be incredibly hard to do. And there's also confusion at the top. Pezeshkian, the president said, look, we're going to stop attacking GCC states, our neighbors. But the IRGC came out like within hours and said, no, that's not true. And they continued those attacks. And with this decentralized structure, then I think there's either a split at the top, or at the top, the president sort of lost control of the situation because the military machine is now fighting headless on its own and will continue to do so. And so again, it's up to the coalition forces to deal this death blow in this next week or so. Otherwise, then we're looking at a very protracted war, more than the month that Trump is talking about.
Right, and while of course it is expanding on, this one polarity of time, the conflict is also rapidly widened, spilling into Lebanon and reaching as far as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean as well. And the burden is being felt by allies and countries that did not seek this war. But Trump has made it clear that diplomacy is a dispensable tool and he will only accept Iran's unconditional surrender, while leaving open, of course, the possibility of deploying American troops on the ground. Now, how far will Trump be willing to go given the economic and humanitarian toll is, continuing to mount with each passing day? And Americans, we already know that they do not have an appetite for these open-ended wars as we've seen in the past.
And doubly so in this case. I mean, again, it's, as I said, the shock and awe tactic, and the idea is in examples in Libya, in Iraq, that you take control very quickly of the country, and then you move into the more difficult phase of trying to put in a new government that's friendly to you, suppress the insurrections. But Trump's got a double deadline on this, because not only do Americans not want a forever war, and he has been selling himself as a peacemaker who's worthy of a Nobel Prize. And here he is, having started the biggest conflagration in the Middle East that we've seen in decades. But he faces the midterms, crucial elections in November, where the Republicans are likely to lose control of the House. And if he goes into those elections and this war is not only continuing, but sparks a major global economic crisis through an inflation shock, through oil prices spiking, then that will just worsen his position in those elections, which are key to him. And so he's going to be very, very keen to bring this quickly to an end. But it remains to be seen if he's able to do that. I mean, personally, I think the States keeps overestimating the power of their military. Their military is the most powerful, but is that enough to win a war like this in 2 weeks? And if we look at what happened in Iraq, if we look at what happened in Afghanistan, then it isn't. And it seems that he's running the danger of having made that mistake again.
Absolutely. And of course, to win a war, you also need to understand what is the definition of success. And there is still some ambiguity there. And we've seen in the past that in many cases that ambiguity has actually, aided Trump in declaring victory, or declaring how the in which way the winds are blowing at a very opportune time. But the chances of seeing a repeat of what we saw perhaps in Venezuela would perhaps be a grave miscalculation on Trump's part here, because the 93 million people of Iran, even though they may be deeply unhappy with the current regime, them accepting a pro-American regime seems unlikely according to many experts. Now, what are the odds that it won't instead consolidate the hardline forces and perhaps trigger a survival response from Iran instead?
I think that's the default assumption, that this is going to consolidate the hardline fractions led by the IRGC. I mean, they get to pick a new leader now, process that started already. And you mentioned Venezuela. I think that's what's driving Trump, that he's been extremely vague about what the goal of this war is. But it seems actually from his comments, the first video he released on the first day is that it's decapitation. He was encouraged by the success of the Venezuelan operation, and that he wanted to decapitate the government and then pause in order to restart the mass protests in the hope that the population would overthrow the government, and then there would be elections. And the former the Shah's son is in the States, and he could be put in as an interim leader friendly to the US in order to oversee that. But again, Iran, as you mentioned, is a very different country from somewhere like Venezuela.
Right.
And in many of those countries, they were led by dictators. So if you take that person out, like Assad, like Gaddafi, then the regime collapses. Whereas Iran is very institutionalized. It's built to deal with crises like this. They've anticipated a decapitation, and the mechanism to put a new leader in and the command structures to operate without the top layer are all there. So the whole idea that you can engineer some sort of colored revolution and get the people to overthrow the Islamic Republic, Islamic State, I think is a long shot. And that actually seems to be what the White House's plan is.